Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. Named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today on January 31st, 2025, we're going to be tackling the question of universal basic income, what it's about, what it's responding to, where it kind of fits, generally about ideas, policy ideas, human ideas, how they evolve, all of that good stuff, with a big, wonderful, important guest of the podcast, at least in my mind, Peter Van Doren. He is the editor of the quarterly journal Regulation, which is about economics and different applied micro topics. And he is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He's been on the podcast to talk about energy independence and the value of life. So go check both of those out, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
So, first question. We talked about this a little bit before, so sorry to make you repeat yourself. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
I guess for me, and given that the audience is probably into social science and policy, what I've learned over time is the importance of history and the relative unimportance of history in official policy school training. So in the master's programs in public policy, of which I taught and am familiar with, there are lots of economists and political scientists and some sociologists and demographers. And then now and then there's a historian. And the older I get, the more I realize that many social science problems have long histories, and thus, and economics and political science don't always make you realize that we are struggling with something we've been struggling with for a long time. And lots of smart people in the past have had answers and thinking about said things. And in fact, the topic we are talking about today is one of them. Poverty and what to do about it, and the idea of a universal basic income has a very long history, and young people need to realize that it's not no one's fault, but older people know stuff and younger people don't, and younger people have to figure out that, in fact, there are relatively few new problems or new answers in policy. They're just lots of answers that people have been struggling and kicking around for some time. And often the fact-value question gets blurred in this. In other words, the reason we struggle over policy is not usually because we don't understand the facts, although sometimes, but because we have different, what economists call welfare functions. We have different weights on the things we value, and that's what the struggle is about. And oddly, that struggle isn't scientific. It can't be scientifically resolved, which makes policy sciences sort of weird in that we ask you to learn stats and math and all of that as if those disciplines somehow give you answers, when in fact, the answers are what's your welfare function and stated, and the underpinnings of welfare functions are actually philosophical, not scientific.
I have so many questions that come off of that. I think the first one is kind of like, what do we do then? Like, part of it is like, obviously we should learn the history of stuff, of the discipline that we, or at least the area that we're interested in, which will help a lot. But regardless of if we have access to that information or if we know that information, we're still having these debates. And I mean, half of it, maybe more than half, is an ignorance of the history, which is part of the problem, which is why you mention it. But even if we were to know it, if there's no answer, or no clear answer or desirable answer. We want to keep moving, keep talking about it, keep researching and kind of like changing the weights and the frictions and whatever to actually get to a better answer or an answer, period. And so what do we do if there's no answer? Like, it seems like there's no point.
What intellectual training does, in my view, is make people more precise in their dialogue and their statements. And in particular, for me, understanding what I call the false therefore problem. That is, most policy analysis ends up with something called the therefore. Therefore, we should fill in the blank. And you have to be very careful about whether you're talking about what economists call efficiency statements, i.e. Pareto improvements, something that somehow, if we do this, we can really make everyone better off, or are policies basically involve choices about whose welfare matters more than others, and therefore politics or political economy is much more zero-sum than positive-sum. And you have to understand. And so knowing that you believe in redistribution, for example, in poverty, let's say you believe in redistribution, and people often say, because they've had some economics, that the marginal value of an additional dollar to a wealthy person is less than the marginal value of the dollar to a poorer person. And that's basically a scientific concept, right? We sort of, that makes sense. We have data that says the care with which people spend dollars decreases, the more they have. And if you don't have much money, every decision you make is extremely important. But therefore, we could take money from rich people and give it to poor people and then improve social welfare. Whoa, right? There's hundreds of years of scholarly fussing about what that sentence means and what is it philosophical or is it scientific, that status of that statement. And I've read papers recently where it's an arcane dispute. It's arcane, but it's actually very, very important, which is in the Office of Management and Budget and in the Office of Regulatory Affairs within OMB, how should we value the costs and benefits of various spending programs and proposed regulations? And what happened in the Biden administration was that they issued a rule that said, if you give money to or benefits to, right, if you spend money on or have regulations that have benefits for lower income people, you should value those benefits much more than you value the costs of more affluent people. And oh my goodness, there's papers, and again, it's sort of shrouded in science, saying the literature suggests this is the right number. And it's like, whoa. In my class, I tell students, you can go right up to that point, and then you have to tell everybody, it's saying, well, it's a normative judgment at that point, how to weight the welfare losses and welfare gains from various people. And I can then point out to, it certainly matters very much how you do that calculation. The answer will differ a lot. And then we face the meta discussion of, well, how do you want to weight all those various answers that liberal social scientists give versus conservative social scientists, even though the name social science is behind their name. they're really having what amounts to a theological or philosophical discussion, and then asserting, which I don't believe in, asserting that because I have training and a PhD, the way I weight those considerations is better than someone with less information. That's a tough. So you see so what training can do is give you knowledge, and then at least if you take my classes or listen to what I have to say or write or read, be careful out there in using that advanced knowledge that you have, because it doesn't go as far as you think it does. In the end, these are quasi-religious fights which have gone on forever and will go on forever. And that's what we're talking about today in part, is what to do about poverty, how that discussion has been with us for the last 500 or 600 years, and how universal basic income as a nerdy policy proposal fits into that big, large discussion, and how for many people it was the answer, including me. That's what we'll get later on. You always have a second question for your guests. What opinions have you had, and have you ever changed them over time? And I thought UBI was a solution to many, many things, and now, given the data we're going to talk about, I'm much less convinced about that. Or the trade-offs I didn't think were there, in fact, are there. And so the hope that poverty policy could escape some of the theological discussions I've alluded to, that can no longer be supported by the trial that we're going to talk about. It is like, it's a big old hockey puck to the head. It's like, oh my goodness, this is, well, what we're going to talk about is big scientific stuff that weighs in on the theological debate that I've alluded to.
Yeah, I feel like you've kind of outlined for us, like, in a way, how these debates evolve and what can actually move the needle if we choose to let it. And if we buy it, really, because it maybe doesn't matter if everyone in the debate has a PhD, because they all have a PhD, but it matters who you're most convinced by in some sort of way. But also, I mean, it doesn't make it useless, I think, is kind of like the difficult thing in the middle of this, right? Because you say you have changed your mind on this front, which A, makes you the perfect person to talk to about this, but B, it just shows why continuing to pursue that stuff being like, I don't know, not just knowledge itself, but like the knowing, the
right.
the values aspect of it, what should be done, the therefore, and everything that leads up to the therefore, which when you first started talking, I was like, well, what is the point of my job? Like, why would I be an economist if truly these conversations will continue before me and happen for so long, well, after me, and then continued for so much time before me? Where does that kind of leave us before we move into like the beginning of where UBI even came from as an idea? How do you kind of roll with this process of like, everyone is weighed in on this debate and everyone will continue to, but I might contribute, or is it just for you?
That's an interesting. I mean, well, economics at its best is it's a training in logic. It's you learn to be very careful about what well, if you accept the training, and sadly, many people misuse advanced training, including many economists, and that disturbs me as much as anything. So the clarity of thinking it's supposed to provide is often used as a weapon to dismiss everyone's concerns when they disagree with you because you say, I'm an economist and I figured this out, and the underlying parameter is this, and therefore it can't be blah, blah, blah. For some things, that you can say that. At its best, the logic in the training of economics can help you rule out other people's statements or recommendations that literally violate the economic equivalent of the laws of physics, right? There are some. And again, prices matter, right? With micro, prices matter, prices matter, prices matter. I have not lost faith in that. Macro, what to do about monetary policy in Spain, macro is voodoo and micro isn't. And everyone economists know this. So it's but training in history, training in any discipline that has rigor allows you to separate things that are logically impossible from things that are logically on the table. That's after that, then the judgment comes in. And again, good instructors and good teachers help students. It's a buzzword to think critically.
Yeah, what you were saying is very critical thinking coded.
But sadly, a lot of what goes on now in policy is just arguing, right? It's just kind of a bad SNL skit. It's not. Yeah, watching these hearings, for the nominees for the Trump administration for the cabinet posts, it's not an exercise in running a good seminar. Let's put it that way, right? They're just so.
There's a reason they're not in university.
Well, again, universities at their best can avoid all this stuff. At their worst, sometimes in the social sciences, at least, they can become cheerleaders with a political agenda. And that isn't critical. That doesn't help students think critically.
I would point to incentives. But maybe that's just the economist in me.
Right.
But it's a tool, right? All right. So let's get started. So this idea is very old. The problem it tries to solve, poverty, is super old. And arguably, especially as people who are aware of and think about kind of living standards and economic growth. As much as macro is voodoo, the graph of living standards is hard to argue with. There's
Correct.
less poverty than there has been. So, I don't know, kind of characterize poverty for us a little bit. Obviously, poverty is not good. We do not wish it upon other people, but we don't have as much poverty as we did then. And so I almost think to begin talking about something, an idea, a policy idea solution that has been around for so long, to address a problem that's been around for so long, but it has changed. We kind of have to understand where we are and where we've been.
So the buzzwords one would get in a class are relative versus absolute poverty. So absolute poverty is literally trying to use a measure of inflation and then saying what the consumption bundle of someone today looks like relative to consumption bundles of people in the past. And a favorite anecdote is, if you've ever been to London and go to the Tower of London and look in the chamber of the king in the Tower of London, and you're thinking, or at least I thought as an economist, this was the richest guy in the world circa fill in the blank. Was it 1200, 1300, whatever? I forget the time.
I'm not going to pretend to know.
The Tower of London. We're viewing the living environs of a very rich person 700-800 years ago. Wow. Doesn't look very amazing, does it? Right?
No.
No. Okay. So that's absolute, right? So So conservatives often point out that the living standards of poor Americans are now much better than the living standards of poor Americans some time ago. And if that's true, the question is, what do poor people think of that argument? And the answer is probably not much, because they compare their living standard to everyone around them, right? So in some sense, poverty policy discussion is always about relative poverty and not absolute, except for some conservatives who argue against the concept of relative poverty and say, poor people, I mean, I have data that I've shared with you, which is, it even stunned me, that they're housing quality indices. And there's a finding that people in the bottom housing quality now have housing that's equal to the median quality house in 1985. And I said, wow. Okay, so if you're a conservative, you say, see, we don't need to do that much. The living standards of poor Americans are rising so that they're now equal to what I grew up in as a young person. And I remember that, and it wasn't very pleasant. And so all that's true. But then liberals say, but they're still falling behind, blah, 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 right? Inequality, et cetera, et cetera. So that debate just goes on and on and on. We can talk about the data, and I can tell you what the real consumption bundles look like, inflation adjusted, and you can then say, but the therefore of whether that's acceptable or not is not a scientific question, right? So that's the first. So then the question is, if the government if the government does something about poverty and gives resources to those who have less, how should it, well, what are the economic consequences of that redistribution? And there's two things that are technical. One's called the substitution effect, and one is called the income effect. And the substitution effect is, at what rate do we decrease the aid we give to poor people as their market incomes increase? Right? Imagine a graph, and imagine the x-axis is your market income and the y-axis is your government supplement, right? Your transfer, either be it appropriated or through the tax code. It doesn't really matter. Think of that graph, think of the lines on those graphs, and then think of the intercept, right? The intercept is the amount we give someone in the US who has zero market income. Liberals want it high, conservatives want it low. Then think of the x-axis, which is as your market income increases, at what rate did the transfers decrease? Okay, most US transfers, you go up to some level called the poverty level, or 138% of the poverty level, or 80% of the, right? There's various programs that have different numbers. And you get money up until that point, and then the money all goes away if you go just slightly above that point, right? And economists have said, wow, that's crazy, right? That creates incentives not to work, because you lose a whole bunch of health or food stamps or other aid if suddenly your income goes up by $10 a week. Well, that creates incentives to be what conservatives don't like, which is dependent. Right? Mm-hmm. So conservatives have long argued that, or economists have said, well, we should just give money to everyone and not condition it on your market income. Right? And then there would be no substitution effect, right? You just get so much a month from the government. Everyone does. And you're free to work or not work and all that. But the tax rate on additional income would not be great, because we don't decrease your benefits as your income increases. There are various studies that show for the median poverty level family in the United States, the marginal tax rate they faced, right, the amount their benefits went down as their income increased, was basically 50%. Well, that tax rate is higher than the tax on the most affluent Americans in the income tax. So if we see what I'm saying? So if we
so we should just tax them more. right?
Well, but that would have
Different
incentive effects,
discussion.
right? So
Yeah.
the same thing applies to poor people. So economists have long argued for something called universal, right? That UBI, giving people money without strings attached and not reducing that amount as income increased, would eliminate the negative work incentives that I've described, and that would lead to a flourishing of work effort on the part of poor people in the United States relative to the programs we now have in place that severely tax their work effort, right? That ends the nerdy portion of this. Well, I mean, that's the basic economic thinking about something called UBI, is that UBI was superior to the programs we have in place because it reduced the tax on work effort for poor individuals that receive those benefits.
And that everyone receives it regardless of work.
Well, that's yeah. I mean, right, and this has a long history. And under President Nixon, it was called the Family Assistance Plan. It's also called a demo grant, right? A grant based on your existence, a demography. But this is pretty hard for most citizens to swallow. That wait, everyone gets a check, even Donald Trump. Everyone gets a check, yes, and. No, in practice, right? We can say no one above, 200,000 a year, right? We have some sort of, not everyone has to get it, but
there's
for
going to be
much
some sort of disincentive somewhere that looks like.
So instead of getting rid of benefits now at the federal poverty level, we get rid of transfers for anyone with family incomes above, 80 or 90 or 100,000 a year, something like that. And everyone below gets the money, and maybe we decrease that a bit, very slowly with income, right? A very subtle benefit reduction rate so that no one really notices. So if you're zero, you get the full amount, and if you're a $99,010, you get $10 a year, right? We slowly decrease the amount with income, much, much more slowly than we do now.
So even just looking at it theoretically, though, wouldn't that still get rid of the incentive to work at the very lowest levels? Or
that's what the substitute. Well, then you're asking what's the income effect? Remember, I said there's two effects.
Mm-hmm.
So the substitution effect is what we've talked about already, which is the rate at which the benefit is taxed. That's the substitution of benefit for work. The income effect is suddenly you've got whatever the amount is, and we might as well get ahead of the story, which is these experiments that we're going to talk about gave people $1,000 a month, gave them $12,000 a year. To middle income and upper income Americans, that doesn't sound, that's, well, all right, 1,000 a month. Yeah. Okay. If you're making $14 an hour, $12 an hour, $10 an hour, whatever, wow, that's a big increase. So the question is, you asked correctly, the scientific question is there an income effect? Does the mere fact of giving someone a big boost of income when they have little income, do they work less simply because of that effect? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Many economists, including myself, thought the answer was no, that it wouldn't be a big deal, that the income effect was small, the substitution effect was large, therefore, right, I said we can't make therefores, but then therefore, we should rearrange our income transfer programs to be more UBI-like and less like the way they are now. We'd have a work explosion in effort at the bottom. Liberals and conservatives could have dinner parties and sing kumbaya, right? This would be, social science answer, and I put that in quotes, to a real problem and a dilemma. Well, so the left and the right have both funded. I mean, your listeners probably may not be aware of this, but liberal and conservative both private and public sector elites got into UBI like 10 years ago. It's just it's the it girl of poverty policy. And there have been some trials, right? And that's what we're going to talk about. There's a big UBI trial in Texas and the Chicago metropolitan areas.
Yeah, and before we get into that really fast, I just calculated if you work for $12 an hour, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for a year, without considering taxes at all, you're only making $24,960 a year.
Yeah.
Now,
right.
And the thing is, people who work for that amount of money might not even be working that consistently, right? There are all sorts of considerations. You might even have a side hustle, so maybe you make more than that, but an added $1,000 a month, 12,000 is a lot. That's
a year, correct?
That's almost a third of what your income would be.
Ding, 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 ding. You have just
super significant.
thought about the income effect.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a huge change. So I guess as we get into like what the experiments were and how they came out and how they did them and like what we saw, just trying to place this. It's not, therefore, this is the solution to the perennial problem of poverty that will always be a thing. It's rather, this is a better solution than past solutions. It
That's
still
correct.
has disincentives,
Yes.
It still has problems, but it will be better before we've tested it. So now we're on to testing it.
That was the thought, correct.
What happens when you test it?
So let me look at my notes to make sure I get the data right. So this was a trial done in Texas and the Chicago areas for 3 years. The participants were people. Let me make sure I get this right here. All right, so we have the population of people were ages 21 to 40. They had income less than 300% of the poverty level. Their average income was $29,900 a year in 2019. They were people from 10 counties in the Dallas metropolitan area and 9 counties in the Chicago metropolitan area. 1,000 participants, and this is random assignment, right? So you've got people, and they then were included in the trial. And then they were randomly assigned to the experimental treatment versus the control group, and I'll describe what that is. 1,000 participants got $1,000 per month for 3 years. It was a 40% increase in their average household income. 2,000 controls got $50 per month, and that was to incentivize them to not drop out and to answer the questions. In other words,
they're getting paid to fill out a survey.
They're getting paid to be lab rats, right? And I'm using that in a positive way. I mean, we learn from trials. This is a very well-designed study.
Yeah, and for a field experiment, I mean, especially one as expensive as that, 1,000 participants is a lot. It's a lot of participants. That's some good data.
Yes. Yeah, this isn't 30 people. Yeah, no, 1,000.
Yeah.
Okay. And drum roll. So after 3 years, the paper was written this summer. And I read it and I said, oh my effing God.
Why?
Well, the UBI recipients worked less than the controls. i.e. the income effect that you alluded to just before I started describing the results. The income effect is real, right? The 40% increase in income that the participants received caused them to work less. 2 percentage points of less employment, i.e. 74% in the controls and 72% were employed in those that received the UBI. And they worked 1.5 fewer hours per week than the controls. Okay? So both what we call extensive and intensive effect, right? The employment rate went down, and those who were employed, their work hours went down. Okay? Not only that, the work effort of those in their household went down, not just the participants, but the extra income was spread to others in the household. The estimate is that $1 of UBI reduced household income by 21 cents, and individual income fell by at least 12 cents. All right. So a 21% household income reduction.
Even including the UBI payment or just earned?
Earned.
Okay.
Earned. The work effort, in other words, the household earned income decreased by 21%, and individual earned income fell by at least 12%. In the classic social science, this is my favorite, right? Professors, when you're nodding off in class and you think you're being fed some BS, here it is. This is the sentence at the end of the paper. Okay, and I read it and I said, oh my God. And I am quoting now. While decreased labor market participation is generally characterized negatively, comma, policymakers should take into account the fact that recipients have demonstrated by their own choices that time away from work is something they prize highly, end quote. And I said, oh Lord, once this gets to the Senate or the House in a hearing, right, some Rand Paul is going to just go nuts with this.
His head
quote.
might explode. So,
and
yeah.
I'll give you some. Megan McArdle is a Washington Post columnist, right? And she translates social science for the reader. She's very, very good. Well, she's trained in economics. She's very good at economically oriented policies and evaluating them. Here's her take on the paper I just quoted from. And this is Megan McArdle's quote in the Post. Everyone loves leisure. Yes, they do, but I doubt this can persuade taxpayers to fund other people's time off, end quote.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's so hard to swallow, right? You say that there's nothing new under the sun, especially in the social sciences. No idea, no question, no solution, quote unquote, that hasn't been thought of. And really what this seems to be validating is the gut instinct of, I don't want to pay for people to do that.
If you ask ordinary people on the street about this long-winded discussion that I've had, they would say, dear Professor Fancy Pants Van Doren, I can tell you, giving poor people more money and they'll just sit on their butts and won't do anything.
Because I would too, right?
Which, well, it's the struggle over stereotypes of poor people and liberal concern about that, and conservatives say, we don't care about your feelings and blah, blah, blah. So here we have a very well-funded, expensive experiment that confirmed a sort of man on the street view of poverty and what we should do about it. And we're back to bupkis, right? Which is,
yeah.
And so,
I mean, yeah, I was going to ask about that last quote, but I think what McArdle said is, I mean, gets to the heart of it, right? Even if you acknowledge on like a value judgment front that leisure is valuable and we would like people to have access to more leisure in ways that higher income people do, you can't ask other people to pay for that. They just won't want to.
You can.
Well, they won't want to.
They won't vote. They won't vote for you.
Yeah, you can ask, but you will not receive. And so, I don't know. It's kind of, what do we do with that? Will this affect at all the discussion? People will cite it and we'll talk about it, but what happens?
So far, this paper came out last summer. I have been stunned by the silence in the chattering classes, both academic and non-academic, because even right, the earned income tax credit, other poverty policies about today, how did we go to hand out so much money through the income tax code to poor families that work? And the answer is Republicans could go along with this, right? The direct transfers through appropriations, no, I don't want to vote for that. But can I give more people who work, can I give money through the tax code in a backdoor way that many voters won't realize exist. Republicans and Democrats have both gone for this, and we now have very extensive funneling of money through the earned income tax credit as well as the child tax credit.
Well,
and
yeah.
So I still think the disincentive effects in that, in other words, the rate at which those tax credits go down as you reach the $20,000, $25,000 a year income level, the rate at which those are withdrawn is still too high in my view, and it discourages work effort. But the notion that UBI gets rid of all those, is the answer now, I think there's silence because the chattering classes that all thought they'd found an answer are now don't know what to chatter about.
Yeah, well, and I was going to ask about this, right? It is not about necessarily whether or not it absolutely fixes the problem. It's just about the relative. And so the silence kind of indicates that we buy that it's not better. But even relatively, putting it in comparison with other sorts of welfare programs, how does it compare? Obviously harder to stomach on the values front. But even just
my
empirically,
own view is economists are pretty united, and I think I can get your listeners to agree that the cliff effects, right? The sort of you get everything, and then if you have $2 more a week income, you lose all your benefits. That's a weird it's bad for incentives. However, I get why it's a political equilibrium, which is, remember that diagram I talked about earlier, which is market income on the x-axis, transfers on the y-axis. What liberals and conservatives seem to agree on is we'll give lots of help to so-called the deserving poor, whoever they are. We can't figure that out probably. And then, but we severely limit it. And we, at some number, we just tax it away very rapidly or cut it off altogether. And that's an equilibrium politically. Even though I would like a much smoother benefit reduction, which would increase the budget for transfers to preserve incentive effects to work. So the way but anyway, I don't think we're going to do that now because it would increase the budget for transfers. And in some ways, we're stuck where we are. I mean, the reason economists use the word equilibria is because they're stable. And so the design of transfer programs in the U.S. is the way it is because of the substitution effect. People care about less, and the income effect they care about more in policy terms. And we end up in this, give a whole bunch of aid to the very poor and then just cut it off really, really rapidly. Full stop.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this, but also just to allow me to ramble and point questions about you about the general discourse on any sort of idea and how we make, I don't know if I'd say progress, but how we trudge through time trying to make progress and perhaps not. It's been really helpful for me, and I've learned a lot. I know my listeners will as well. I have one last question for you, and that is, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
The answer is what we talked about today. I mean, UBI. I thought UBI would solve many, many more problems than it would create, and I appear to be wrong. And
when did you think that?
After I read this paper. I mean, I just
wow.
That's why I brought it up as a topic for discussion today, because I knew about your question, the questions you tend to ask, and the minute I read this paper, I just said, "Oh wow, game over." This is. Wow. Now there'll be more. I mean, maybe it's not over, but The fact that the authors of this paper had to scramble so hard at the end to write that sentence that I told you about means I think it's over. It's because they had to squeeze so hard to get language that said, oh, poor people don't work and we give them more money. But economists like choices, and they made their choice.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guests for their time and insight. I'd also like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. It means a lot. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests, or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at greatantidote@libertyfund.org. Thank you.